when I came up here, I thought this would be a great place to go. I'm getting bit by mosquitoes, that's why I'm scratching. Because one, nobody usually comes up here. We've had 2 people pass by now. And you can get a nice view of the city, even though it's overcast and raining a little bit. But actually, not too great of a view from here. I thought the trees were a little lower. You could see a bit better, but I guess not. But you can see the airplane there. All right. But I can get nice framing at these trees. We'll stand like this maybe. Maybe you should pull you a little forward. You want to come closer? Let's pull you a little closer. Why not? We won't edit this because it's raw. It's real. There. How's that? That's better. If I keep hitting myself, it's because I got bit by mosquitoes. All right, so where did we leave off? So we left off with Daddy having studied in China, in Beijing, studying Mandarin, and then because of the popular culture at the time, deciding to go to Taiwan. So, yes, I looked at places in Taiwan and I studied with Taida. They had a language program there, so that's where I went, and I decided I would learn Mandarin there. And again, coming to Taiwan, I didn't know anybody. I knew nothing about Taiwan really, outside what I read in like a travel guide. Because back then, the internet wasn't such a big of a thing as it is today. I mean, we didn't have YouTube, so there was no way to look up stuff like that. And so everything I learned was from little travel guidebooks. And I came over and I didn't know anybody. Yeah, I didn't know anybody. So I was coming in blind. But my plan was I would come over and stay at a hostel a few days, and then I would find an apartment to stay in. And yeah, and then start my studies at Taida and learn Mandarin for a year. And then I would go to Hong Kong, to Chinese University in Hong Kong, to study my master's degree in anthropology, cultural anthropology. That was the idea. 2 years of Mandarin study to get really firmly locked in, and then we'll go to study our master's degree. Well, somebody's walking by, so I'm becoming self-conscious now. But we'll try, push through this. Remember rule number 1, don't care what other people think. That reminds me of a story. I think it was Patrick Stewart. Patrick Stewart, I believe, if I remember his autobiography correctly in his audiobook, he said every time before he would go out on stage, he would say I don't give a shit, or I don't give a damn. Not saying that he didn't care about his performance, but basically like, I'm going to go out there and do the best I can and put it all on the line, and whatever happens, happens. But as long as I do my best. Probably getting that wrong, but anyways. So, come to Taiwan, come to Taipei, and my first or second day in Taiwan, I decided I would go to the Taipei City Hall because they had a museum there, and I figured that would be a good place to get to know the city and understand the layout and figure out where in Taipei I would like to live. Ideally, I would want to live by Taida, the university, the Taiwan University, National Taiwan University, but I didn't know because Taipei is a pretty expansive place. There's places in the mountains, there's places in valleys, there's places by the river, so I had no idea. But while I was there, this very energetic young man, call me young man, I was younger than him, came up to me and, he really wanted to help me. He wanted to talk to me in English. And I spoke to him in Mandarin because I insisted that I'm here in Taiwan to learn Mandarin. I need to speak Mandarin. I can speak English at home. I've spoken English for the past 20 plus years of my life. I want to speak Mandarin. So he spoke to me in English and I spoke to him in Mandarin. And at that time, because I had come from Beijing and all the learning and training I had done was in Putonghua. So I had a strong R sound, the classic Beijing R, like 冰棍啊，我要来一个冰棍啊，你吃什么呀？我想吃烤鸭呀。That kind of R sound. Anyways, so he came up to me, and because of my time in China, I had learned that being this face, you needed to be cautious of your surroundings and what people's intentions were. Side note, story, Beijing. So when I lived in Beijing, I lived in a hutong, which is like the little alleyway, the old alley streets that were created during the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty. And every day, for pretty much lunch and dinner, I would always go to the same restaurant in the hutong. So the patrons there and the boss became very familiar with me. So my final night there, the boss said, hey, how are you gonna go to the airport? And I said, I'll just grab a taxi. He said, no, you don't need a taxi. I'll drive you out to the airport. And I thought that was very gracious of him. And again, this is an anecdote. It doesn't represent all people from Beijing or all people from China. It's a different period of time. So this is just my anecdote to say that based on this face, you had to be, let's say, cautious of your environment and people's intentions. Not everybody acted like this, but this is just... Anyway, so I had developed a relationship with this gentleman that he knew me over the past year as I was studying. So I figured, oh great, I can save some money, and I wasn't gonna like stiff him or anything, but I planned I would, tip him the gas fare or something as a thank you because he was so kind to me. I should note that in all the time that I stayed at his restaurant, he never gave me any discounts or anything of that nature, or free food or a soup or anything. Anyways, not that I expected that. Just trying to be objective. So, next day comes, I pack up all my stuff, he drives up and I load up, and we drive out to the airport. And on the way there, there's a toll booth, and he's like, oh crud, I didn't bring any money for the toll booth. Can you take care of this? So I was like, yeah, that's fine. So I pay him some money. I give him some money for the toll. Then we keep going along, and as we're going, he's starting to talk about how beat up his car is, and it's falling apart, and the air conditioning doesn't work, which, as far as I could tell, the air conditioning worked fine. But he just was going on and on about his car and all the troubles he was having in life with the restaurant and this, that, and the other. And I sympathized with him and tried to understand where he was coming from. So when we got to the airport, I wished him well, and I gave him some money for the gas. I said, hey, thank you so much for taking care of me over the past few months, at your restaurant, enjoying your great food and stuff like that. And he also taught me a rule that was in China. He said, if you can't see the kitchen, don't eat there. That was one of his rules. He told me, if you can't see what's going on in the kitchen, don't eat there because the food's going to be poor quality, which my biggest fear that I had when I lived in China was getting sick. And fortunately for the time that I was there, I didn't get sick. Well, I did get alcohol poisoning, but that's another story. Maybe we'll save that for another. So, I hand him some money for the gas, and he thanks me, and then he gets out of the car and comes over, and he shakes my hand, and he says, thank you, I wish you all the best of luck. But then he pulled me in, and he said, is there any way you could give me more money? I really am desperate for money right now. And I was like, all right, sure. And so I gave him some additional money to help him. But I also felt a little disappointed by that because, I felt like I had sort of been, I don't want to say tricked or duped, that sounds bad, but I just felt, just disappointed because I thought he was doing this out of friendship, and maybe I'm being cynical, and he was just having a bad day, but I just felt disappointed, but I gave him some money and as a gift, and he seemed satisfied. But anyways, the point being, having lived in China and having been there, I knew that you had to be cautious about what people's intentions were, especially in Beijing and in tourist areas. People might come up to you and say, come with me to this tea house, and then they leave you with like a $300 bill. We're just students practicing our English. So this guy came up to me, and he was very energetic, and he was in a museum, and I again kept that same attitude of like, I got to be cautious. I don't know what his intentions are, because I knew nothing about Taiwan. I didn't know what Taiwan was like. I was still coming over from the China mentality. So he said, well, I get off work, or I get out of here at 4 or something. He's like a volunteer, and I'll call you when I'm done. I was like, oh, okay, sure. And he's like, what's your phone number? And I'm like, and I reluctantly gave him my phone number, thinking, well, I can either ghost him or just not answer the phone, right? So I finished up with the museum, I left, and then probably an hour or so later, while I was still outside, I had just gone up into Taipei 101, and I came down, and I was just checking out the area around that. He called me and said, hey, I got up, and I decided to pick up. I don't know why. I thought I would ghost him, but I thought, I'll give it a shot. So he called me, and He's like, hey, I just got off work. Or I just finished my volunteer shift. Do you want to, where are you? And I said, oh, I'm in front of the city hall. He's like, great, can I meet you? And I'm like, yeah, okay, sure. So then he took me to Longshan Temple and all these places in the evening in Taipei. And he's like, well, what are you doing tomorrow? And I'm like, well, I'm going to be looking for an apartment. I got to find a place to live. And so he's like, oh, I'll help you. I'm like, okay, sure. This is where I'm staying now. And he's like, oh, I know that area. I'll meet you at the 7-Eleven around the corner. I'm like, okay. So sure enough, next day, I meet him at the 7-Eleven, and he had printed out like probably 10 or 12 apartments for us to look at from this website 168. I didn't know anything about Taiwan. I didn't know that's where you would look. I was just going around the areas I liked, because that's what the guidebook said, and looked at bulletin boards to find places to rent. But he went online and found 12 apartments that looked interesting. And so sure enough, he went with me to all these places, and we eventually found one at the very end of the day that I liked. But long story short, that gentleman has become a very close friend of ours, and you've met him many times, Chembel. And that taught me that Taiwan was very different than China. And ever since I've moved and lived in Taiwan, I've been incredibly lucky, to the point that at times I would call this the Lost Island. Now, you might not recognize that. The Lost Island was from a TV show on ABC called Lost. It was this strange island where really random happenstances and things would happen. And that's how I felt living in Taiwan. All of these very not conspicuous, very suspicious things in a good way would happen to me here. For example, like Chembel and I would be out having dinner someplace, and I'd say, hey, whatever happened to so-and-so? And I guarantee you within 5 to 10 minutes, so-and-so would walk through the door, or we'd walk past so-and-so. When I was studying here, well, we'll get there. Let's not get ahead of the story. So anyways, studied Mandarin, found an apartment, and while I was studying here, the point is, I fell in love with Taiwan. The people here were just incredibly friendly and gregarious and amicable. Everybody was just so wonderful, and the environment, I love the environment. It reminded me of home in Florida. And I think also what it reminded me of when I was young in Florida is that the feeling that I got here was very similar to the feeling that I had in the States, because things here still, to a certain extent, haven't been, what's the word? I can't think of it. Oh, not homogenized, but people still live next door to, like, you may live next door to a lawyer who lives next door to a chef who lives next door to a construction worker. They haven't become so, it's not segregated, it's not the word, but anyways, I'll think of it later and be screaming at myself. So it reminded me a lot of my childhood and what that life was like in Florida before, and also what my parents told me about when they were growing up in Ohio, your grandparents. So the plan was finish Mandarin and then go study at Chinese University of Hong Kong. Well, that didn't end up happening because I fell in love with Taiwan. I decided I would not study at Chinese University in Hong Kong. Instead, I would try and find a university here. So I looked at Taiwan University. They had an anthropology program, but theirs was mostly focused on archaeology and the Yuanzhumi, the Taiwanese indigenous studies. So then I went to Qingda, National Tsinghua University, and they had more of a cultural anthropology program, which is what I was interested in. So I applied and I was accepted, and therefore I was going to stay in Taiwan a few more years, but move from Taipei down to Hsinchu. And so that's what I did. Went home for the summer, worked at Disney, and Disney still was in my life. Disney was still part of my life, with making money on the summers. And so went home, packed up, came back to Taiwan, and lived in Hsinchu, where I studied anthropology at National Tsinghua University. And my master's thesis was going to be, of course, about Disney, specifically Hong Kong Disney, Hong Kong Disneyland, and how people use Hong Kong Disneyland, how groups of people use it, and using Lefebvre's theory of space, about how space is designed, like how people conceptualize a space, how it's actually designed, how it's physically implemented, and then how it's used by the people and how they interpret it. Lefebvre. So I wrote the thesis and enjoyed my 3 years in Taiwan, where I did spend about 6 to 9 months in Hong Kong, where I was doing field work at the end of my studies. And is at that time, which would have been 2010, 2011, Disney announced they were going to open the park in Shanghai. Now, I knew that the Shanghai park was coming because Disney specifically said that Hong Kong Disneyland was a stepping stone into mainland China. So we knew Shanghai was coming, we just didn't know when. So when I was finishing my degree, that is when they announced Shanghai Disneyland. And at that time I said, I was struggling with two things. One was, I had already sort of set down on this path that I was going to become a professor of anthropology. So after master's degree school, I was going to get my PhD and study anthropology. But what ended up happening? Well, I applied for PhD school in several universities in California and the University of Hawaii, and I got rejected. None of them wanted me. But the odd thing was, after getting rejected, I did not feel disappointed. I felt relieved, and that worried me more. The fact that I felt relieved that I didn't get accepted told me that this is probably not the path I should be taking. So I decided, all right, well, let's take a year off. And instead, I shifted focus from going the PhD route to focusing all my time and energy back at Disney. Let's see if I can become a Disney person again. So after graduating with my master's here in anthropology in Taiwan, which I should note, just for myself and for future reference, when I was finishing up my degree and my classmates were asking me, what do you think you're going to do when you graduate? I was already toying with the idea of going back into theater. I was looking at Valencia Community College and thinking, is it crazy if I go back and get an AA in theater? I don't know. I just was drawn to that again. And that'll come later in our life. So, my life. So, yeah. Focused. I went back to Florida and I moved back to Florida full time, and I said, I'm going to give myself X amount of years, like a year, to really push the Disney thing and see what happens. Now, because I was still status with Disney, I was working under a status they called seasonal, which meant you could work, as long as you worked 1 day a year at that time, you could keep your status as a cast member, keep all your benefits. So I would work my 1 day a year, but I would work more than that. I work on the holidays, summer. So when I came back, I was still seasonal. So I quickly put in for full-time. And after a few months, I got full-time, and I was working guest relations at that time. I was still a tour guide. And, I pushed really heavy that this was going to be my thing. I was going to push hard and get into Shanghai Disneyland. So I tried networking. I emailed people. I talked to people. I became a VIP tour guide. And I got lots of advice from lots of different people, one of which was not great advice, but as I said in an earlier video, you have no idea, you got to stay open and you have no idea what might happen. So one piece of advice was that being in if I wanted to move up in the company, being in guest relations was hard to do that because you were a star among stars in guest relations. Because in guest relations, you couldn't just get hired, at least when I was there, you couldn't get hired straight into guest relations. You had to work for the company for an amount of time, and then you could be promoted from within. You'd apply again and go through this panel interview process and stuff to be in a guest relations pool, and they would pull from there. So in guest relations, you're already sort of the cream of the crop, in theory. And the suggestion I received from what I'll call the Magic Kingdom Guidance Counselor, I don't recall what his official title was, but that's what we called him, the Guidance Counselor. He suggested I go back to attractions because as in his words, you're a star among stars, but if you go back to attractions, you'll be a star among duds. And that's his words. So I took his advice and transferred out of guest relations into Fantasyland attractions. And to be honest, that was a bad decision. It was a bad decision because it made me, I was unhappy. I thought I would make more money in I thought I'd make more money in attractions because I'd work more overtime, like I did when I was a kid in Adventureland Liberty Square attractions, which didn't happen. And I ended up not liking it as much as I did because I think I didn't have the friends and the people around me like I did when I was younger in Adventureland Liberty Square attractions. Fantasyland was a very different beast than Adventureland Liberty Square. So, yeah, but here's fate. We don't know why. While I was working Peter Pan one day, I was at, I think it was at Greeter or something, and I saw a DSA, a VIP, Disney VIP tour guide, and he had all these Chinese people around him. and some foreigners, some Americans. Americans, as we call them in America. Some American Disney management people. And I decided I would approach them because I speak Mandarin. I've studied Mandarin all my life. So I went up and I started talking to one of the Chinese people. And I started, because of my friends and connections, I knew a lot about what was happening in Shanghai and some of the project details and things like that. And I started talking to them about the Peter Pan's flight, and that Shanghai was also going to have a Peter Pan's flight, and what the differences between ours and Florida was, and Shanghai was going to be, for example, Florida was just one row. It was like you can fit 3 people at most, but Shanghai was going to have 2 rows, and on and on and on. So they went on the ride, and I figured, put the seat in. And then I got bumped out to go to break. So when I got bumped to break, instead of going to break, I stood at the exit of the ride and I waited for them to come off. So when they came off and came around, I started chatting up that guy again. And I was talking to him. And then now by this time, all the Chinese delegates had come over and they were talking to me. And the 2 or 3 Disney guys who work for Disneyland International, they were standing over in the corner, and they said they were over there. And then finally, one of the Chinese guys, the first one that I was talking to, turned around to the other guy and said, I can't remember the guy's name. He's like, Eric, why is he not on your team? This guy speaks Mandarin. No one on your team speaks Mandarin. He knows more about the project than anybody we've talked to. Why is he working in an attraction and not working on the Shanghai Disneyland project? You need a guy like him. And so that was the end of the conversation. He walked away at that point. So then that guy from Disneyland International came over and got my information and wrote it down. And I figured that who knows what's going to happen. By this time, my year was up. Now, I should also mention that during this time that I was back in Florida, my professor was gracious enough to let me teach at my alma mater. I taught a class on Disney, and I taught a class on Chinese culture as well in the evening school, which I enjoyed a lot, teaching adult college students. So anyways, my time was up. I had given myself over a year. The year had come and passed, and nothing really major, in my opinion, had happened. Instead, I was down in attractions, trying to work my way up, thinking I'd become a manager or something. And I missed Taiwan. I wanted to come back to Taiwan. So I went back to my management team and guest relations, and I told the area manager at the time, I said, hey, look, I'm leaving. I'm going to go back to Taiwan, but can I come back to guest relations as a seasonal cast member? And he was he didn't have to do that. He could have said, heck no, you're out of here. But for whatever reason, the goodness, kindness of his heart, he let me come back as a seasonal cast member to guest relations. Now, jokingly, all of my friends call my time in Fantasyland my DU, or my cross utilization time. Cross U was this thing Disney used to have where at busier times, they would pull people from backstage to work on stage, like handing out maps and stuff. Anyways, I came back to guest relations and I worked a few more months. And the reason I wanted to go back to Taiwan was because I met someone, and that person happened to be your mom. And the question about how we met Mom and what that next chapter of my life is, we'll leave for the next one. How's that sound? We're already at 23 minutes right now, so we'll leave that for the next one. All right? So I hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll see you next time. All right? Love ya. Bye.